Welcome back, everyone, to Remember What's Next. I'm Ellie Bass, and we are doing a special series of Remember What's Next. We are sitting down with Professor Elan Javanfard, who's bringing the lens of psychology and trauma, and Rabbi Spiro, who's bringing, as always, the long arc of Jewish history. Together, the three of us are asking questions that feel especially relevant today around how does trauma carried in our people's history actually live inside us today, seeing what the world looks like and how we're responding to it on the ground, and how do we use this information in order to make better choices going forward. So I'm really super excited to be here with Professor Elan Javanfard and with Rabbi Spiro. Hi, guys.
Hi,
Hello. Thank you for
great to
having
be
me.
Uh,
here. I have
yeah,
to add,
so
Ellie,
exciting.
this is so exciting. We mentioned before, this is the first time we have ever had a guest
Yeah, it's
on
really
on
awesome.
our show.
So fun to open the space.
So we met Eli. I met Elon in at a Passover program, which was the cruise without the ship in Phoenix, Arizona. And as soon as I started talking to him, I said, "We got to get this guy on the show." So I'm really excited that we got him on so quickly, even though he's a wandering Jew and he's all over the place. So Elon,
And
great to have
doing
you with us.
Thank you for
amazing.
having me. It's an honor and a pleasure.
So cool. Okay. So we're going to start with defining our terms. I think it's a really important framework to set up to have a quite a nuanced conversation. So the terms that we want to define are number one, right? Who are the Jews? What is the history that we're going to be dealing with? And secondly, from the psychological side, what are we dealing with in terms of trauma? What does that mean? How does it inform us? How do we deal with it? So I think Ken's going to begin us with the history that we're navigating, the context, and then we're going to go over to Elan to start to understand what is trauma, and then we will dig into Ashkenazim. So, Ken, you want to start us off?
Yeah, so we just to define a few terms. We've talked about all these things in previous episodes, and I'm sure we'll put in the liner notes for those who want to go in detail. That's not our job now, but just to make sure that we all have a baseline of information, we have to first start by defining what is a Jew. We are a people. We are a faith. We're not a race. This is going to become very apparent as we go through, and we've talked about before. Anyone can join the Jewish people, but it's very important to understand that as a people and a nation, which means even if you're not observant in any way, you're still part of the Jewish people. And even if you are not part of the Jewish nation living in Israel, you're still part of the Jewish people. As we're going to talk about, there's much diversity genetically and culturally in the Jewish world today, but we have a common origin, which we talked about at the very, very beginning, like season one, part one. We are all, on some level, descendants of a couple named Abraham and Sarah. So we are one extended family tree that's had a lot grafted onto it throughout history. So that's important part number one. And to understand that, we understand on first of all a genetic level. We did this 2 episodes ago. There is a common genetic connection between all Jews. We'll talk about Ashkenazi Sephardi. We'll define that again once more briefly. But even though we've lived in many places and many, many people have joined the Jewish people and many, many Jews have left and opted out, we have a common haplotype, a genetic common connections that varies from Ashkenazi to Sephardi to Mizrahi, but we all go back to the root of the same tree, which means that even though I up here in the corner of the screen for those watching on YouTube will see me with my pale Ashkenazi European skin, and you could look down to the lower left and see Elon with his nice Persian tan. We have more in common with each other genetically on average than Elon would have with all the Iranians running around in Tehran today, or you're Tehrani, right? I think, or Shirazi.
Shirazi.
Shirazi. And I have more in common with Elon, even though my skin, hair, and eye color might look more like a Northern European. So that is a very important thing. So there is a common connection that we see until today, although I have to say that Elon, being a real Mizrahi Jew, his genetic connection to the original Jewish origins is actually purer than mine. That's something we talked about previously. We also talked about in a previous episode the notion of a Jewish personality, which also comes from Abraham and Sarah. These are traits that are not unique to the Jewish people, but they're inherently within Jews to a higher percentage than anywhere else. which is this incredible think outside the box, revolutionary thinking, which goes back to Abraham, bringing the idea of one invisible, infinite God into the world in a world where everyone is worshiping idols. An incredible drive because it takes tremendous drive to push radically transformative ideas on the world. This is another Jewish trait we see. Disproportionate Jewish impact on the world clearly illustrates this, and also caring. Again, non-Jews can care, but Jews are kind of obsessed with fixing the world. This also goes back to Abraham and Sarah, whose ultimate mission was to connect humanity to God as the ultimate, cure-all for humanity's woes, bring down the values and spirituality that comes from relationship with God. So we summarize all that. Basically, what we have is this kind of spiritual DNA, this Jewish personality, and we have this physical DNA. And the trauma that Elan's going to talk about, when you mix the trauma, which is a varied experience, we're going to get into much more of that later, with the different geographic cultural experiences of Jews, it's kind of like, mixology in drinks. We get different cocktails of both positive and negative. I mean, all Jews were traumatized to a certain level, but we're going to see that. But the trauma varies depending upon the laboratory in which it was experienced historically. The only other thing I really wanted to throw in as an introduction is just to define our other terms. So we have the general term Jew, and that's defined by someone whose mother is Jewish or converted halachically, accepting the Torah and joined the Jewish people. That's subdivided today into three categories, all of which we've done multiple parts on. You're welcome to listen to in depth. We have the idea of Ashkenazim, which is a general term for Jews of Europe who grew up in the Christian world. And that basically is an experience that really takes off about 1,000 years ago, approximately. We have an earlier term it's called a Sephardic, which comes from the word Spain. Ashkenazi comes from the word Germany, although they're not linked to Germany. It's just the earliest main community was on the Rhine. Sephardi, which comes from the word Sfarad, which means Spain, which is the Jewish community, which begins back in the Roman Empire thousands of years ago, but explodes in the 8th century until the expulsion of those Jews in 1492. That was the center of the Jewish world before its expulsion. And we have the idea of Mizrahi Jews, Mizrahi, which means east, because often people conflate Sephardi and Mizrahi together. Sephardim are actually a subgroup of usually Mizrahi Jews, meaning their origins, as they ended up in Spain, they came from North Africa, but before North Africa, they were in the Middle East, Israel, and the surrounding countries of today, like Iraq and Iran, Persia, things like that. But Mizrahi Jews are the closest geographic community to the original origins of us, the Jewish people, as a nation, which is the land of Israel, which means that they have the longest continuous physical presence in any piece of real estate, going back to Jews living in Iraq since the time of the first expulsion, destruction of the first temple 2,500 years ago. They happen to also be the Jewish population that is most probably pure in terms of its genetic origins, least augmented by interacting with people further afield in North Africa and Spain, in Europe and Eastern Europe. So if we were to rewind the tape, we would see genetically all the Jews merging back into one, and the dilution becomes less and less until you go back to the pure Jewish people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and his 12 sons and the Jewish people. Geographically, all back in one area. And again, we would still find, whether it's thousands of years ago or today, that Jewish personality of the radically transformative thinking, the drive, and the caring is always colored the Jewish collective personality. So kind of with that in mind, we can start by, rewind back to the beginning, but we also understand one other thing I want to throw in, and then I'll open up to our discussion, is that unfortunately, trauma has been a constant aspect of the Jewish historical experience. We went through many traumas when we were unified people in the land of Israel, of foreign invasions and the destruction of the first temple and expulsion. We went through traumas in the second temple period, with the Greek occupation of Israel, Hanukkah, the Roman destruction of the land of Israel. And then as Israel ceases to be really the center, it's always spiritually the center of the Jewish world, nationally our center, but in terms of demography, as Jews scatter far afield, that trauma tends to really variegate more so that what the Ashkenazi Jews will go through at a different period of time and different kinds of trauma will be very different from the what the Sephardic Jews will go through. And we'll talk about the specific episodes and what Mizrahi Jews will go through. But Ellie began by mentioning something, trauma is always a part of the Jewish world, but why I think it is so important today is we have now come back to our land, and about half the Jews in the world are living there. And the Jewish world collectively and in Israel experienced a horrendous, one of the worst traumas in Jewish history is what happened on October 7th, going back to 2023, which, while numerically was far from the worst tragedy in Jewish history, but on a level of traumatic experience, which, due to the age of technology and the internet and everything being streamed live, was poured en masse into the collective Jewish personality. So I think it's still very, very fresh. We're still recovering from it. And I'm sure Elan will explain you. We never recover from all these things totally.
Hmm.
So I think of nothing more opportune than talking about that now, whether it's what Israel went through or the massive explosion of anti-Semitism that the world has been experiencing since October 7th. And since October 7th, this is, I think, where we are now, and a great place to begin the actual discussion because it colors who we are in a positive and in a negative way. And it presents us with lots of opportunities and lots of challenges.
Awesome. I actually have one quick question for you, Ken, and then I want to turn to you, Elan. What does the term Mizrahi translate as? What does that term mean?
Yeah, so Mizrach means east,
East.
but it's
Got it.
Jews of the East, which is the Jews living in, again, Sephardi and Mizrahi have one thing in common. These are basically Jews who lived in the Islamic, not necessarily Arab, like as Elon will tell us,
Hmm.
Persians are not Arabs, but the Islamic world. So that's the
Got it.
common shared experience. But Eastern Jews, even though sometimes they were to the west, if you live in Morocco today, you're further to the west of Israel, but they still
Right.
considered Eastern as this kind of generic term.
Awesome. Okay, super helpful. Okay, so we're going to turn to you, Professor, to open this up for us. I think just on a personal note to say, I being in the Jewish community today, I would say both as a coach, as a teacher, as a human, as a Jew, a lot of what I'm encountering is no one's okay. Like people are struggling. They're struggling whether they're in Israel or outside of Israel. People are really just both in a state of shock as well as fight, flight, freeze. All of the things are happening. And not everyone knows how to contextualize perhaps why so many people are so surprised how freaked out they actually are. And so I'm hoping that we can try to start to unpack that for people also. And I think what you have to say is really going to be helpful for people to be able to be like, oh, wow, I'm not crazy. And something else is playing into this, even though it's the present and what's happening in this moment is scary, but it's loaded with all kinds of other stuff. So can you define it for us? Can you set it up for us? What are we talking about with this very bandied about word on TikTok and Instagram, this idea of trauma? What does it mean? How do we understand it? And how can we start to apply it to our Jewish history?
Yes. So there's so much to unpack there. First, as Ken mentioned earlier, people
Oh,
don't
sorry.
necessarily.
I'm going to
Yes.
actually interrupt you just for 1 second because people don't know who you are.
Oh,
So, can
hi.
you just give us a quick little intro onto what you do and how
Yes.
you do it, and then please lead the way into our
Yes.
definition?
Sure. So I'm Elan Javanfard. Born and raised in Los Angeles, come from two parents who escaped the Iranian Revolution, moved to Los Angeles, met here, and got married in LA. I have a background in clinical psychology, and I also have a degree as a marriage and family therapist. So I practice as a clinician part-time, but most of my work is in broad systems work related to the Jewish community. So I am a professor and faculty member at Pepperdine University in Malibu, and I also teach at Touro University in their graduate school of psychology. Interestingly enough, they have a Frum program for exclusively Orthodox individuals to get psychological training through an Orthodox lens. And several years back, I spent some time trying to identify quite a bit of the information related to the differentiation between trauma within the sects of Jewish communities. This was a project that I had started right after October 7th. I got the opportunity to go to Israel and do treatment and work in Israel for individuals who experienced the traumas and horrors of October 7th. We went and did EMDR, which is a certain type of therapeutic model, at the Nova Festival site with survivors there, and have continued to have an ongoing relationship with several trauma clinics in Israel.
Wow.
And to the same point that you just mentioned, Ellie, we keep hearing the word trauma, and I think pre-October 7th in the Jewish world, people use the word trauma, and post, people still continue to use that word in many different ways.
Hmm.
But it's good to define the terms to better understand what we're discussing. So the American Psychological Association has created a definition for the word trauma. So the broadly defined term is anything that happens that overwhelms your individual capacity to cope with just your day-to-day life, that results in some kind of psychological or emotional or physiological effect on you. That doesn't have to be just an external event. It could be an internal event that you experience as well. The oftentimes classic example of this is going to be what people define as life-threatening scenarios. So you go through war, you go through displacement, you experience an acute car crash. People usually define that as trauma. The contextualization that's important is there's really two types of trauma if we're breaking this down as lay as possible rather than a full graduate school course. We can kind of break it down into two categories. What we like to call capital T trauma, like the letter T in the word trauma, and lowercase
Hmm.
t trauma. And some people have heard that term before as well, the capital T or lowercase t. Capital T is going to refer to acute life-threatening scenarios like the ones we described. So war, genocide, the displacement, large systems that happen externally, usually to a person, that lead them to feel incapacitated due to the overwhelming amount of stress that they cannot
Hmm.
cope with. So all of us as individuals have learned to cope with our day-to-day lives with the small things that happen on a day-to-day basis. But when something overwhelms our coping system, that is a trauma mechanism.
So does that
Yeah,
mean, for instance, a symptom of that would be PTSD, right? So somebody who's having a really hard time functioning because their system's overwhelmed with something that's happened to them?
perfect. Great point. An individual who experiences a traumatic event, like a capital T trauma that we just described, whose system is no longer able to cope going forward with that change. So if like from today they were coping and tomorrow this event happened and ongoing for a period of time, usually approximately over a month to get a diagnosis of PTSD, you need to have had this acute stress for over a month that you have not been able to cope with. And it continues to linger with some kind of emotional or psychological symptoms that can generally lead to a post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis. Um, People have asked me very frequently, what percent of Israel has PTSD? And my
Mhm.
response to that is you kind of have to be post-trauma to get the diagnosis of post-trauma. They're still
Wow.
in the
Yeah.
trauma. So it's hard
Wow.
to explain that. But the other hand of that is what many people like to call lowercase t trauma, which is going to refer to more chronic stressors or relational stressors. So, such as ongoing emotional neglect in someone's childhood, instability in the home, food insecurity, housing insecurity, or persistent fears that a person may have had in their environment of some kind of issue or stress. Those are lowercase t traumas, which again are not to say they're not as impactful or meaningful. They're just more chronic and relational rather than external, oftentimes. And ongoing lowercase t traumas can lead to a diagnosis of PTSD, but also alter the way a person's personality is shaped. And I think what's fascinating is that the entire existence, and Ken mentioned this earlier, the entire existence of Jewish people is survival. It's not a metaphor, it's a lived and documented experience of
Mm.
repeated, prolonged events for us. And people don't necessarily recover from trauma. They learn to shape a new reality, coping with the trauma they went through. Kind of like for anyone who's ever lost a family member or parent, you don't overcome your grief. You learn to live with your grief. You don't overcome your trauma per se. You learn to internalize that trauma in different ways. And there are adaptive ways, which would be healthy, positive, pro-social ways people deal with their trauma. And there's also negative or maladaptive ways that people deal with their trauma. And those kind of shape the realities that people go through.
So it seems like one of the ways we could think about it is everybody experiences trauma in some shape or form to some degree or another, and whether it's ongoing or one massive event. But the question is, do you move into build back better, or do you move into collapse and falling apart and victimhood and not being able to metabolize that event into something that makes you actually stronger or more resilient? Did I get that right?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. And I think what you are describing is what people may have heard of as the term, which is, it could be synonymous in many ways, post-traumatic growth or resiliency.
Hmm.
The idea of a person being able to experience a traumatic event and that makes them stronger, and they wouldn't have been that strong unless the trauma occurred.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, we don't hear that term a lot at all, so that's fascinating.
Question also, Elan, apropos what you're saying and what I'm talking about, you're dealing with trauma on a personal level of an experience, a group at an event, October 7th, or a family, small t trauma. Um, dysfunctionality. So the question we really want to hear from you about is the collective Jewish family experience, how it's been adapted. Maybe the term, maybe I don't know if you want to go into it now, maybe it's for later, but certainly when people are in a situation of trauma, like you could talk about how African Americans during slavery learned how to function in Jim Crow South by adapting certain behavior patterns as a kind of a survival mechanism of what you do and don't do, like don't make eye contact with them, bow your head and say yes, sir. And also, but the idea that I'm really curious is the idea of the epigenetics, which I'm just throwing out that you're going to go into, because I think this plays, and we're going to talk about this later, a big role in how the Jews individually, but certainly collectively, especially groups of Jews react today, is this idea of the trauma that gets embedded. I'm going to leave that to you to explain into the Jewish actual DNA as opposed to the Jewish neuroses that because your mother made you feel guilty because you didn't get good enough grades to become a doctor versus actually passing it on a level that's actually ingrained within us and how we cope with that and how it manifests itself. So that's something I'd really like to hear from you about.
Amazing. So what you're describing is more akin to communal trauma. Communal trauma is when an entire group goes through some kind of collective traumatic experience. An example I can give just for your entire audience that the entire world faced is we all had a communal trauma related to COVID. That was a communal trauma. It has completely shaped the identity of the entire race of humanity around what transpired. So, differently than individual trauma, communal traumas are going to reshape the norms and values and expectations for that entire population.
Mhm.
So, like you described, where people went through communal traumas related to slavery, and African Americans experienced a different norming and values and expectations related to the rest of society. Jewish history is sustained through many examples of collective trauma. Whether we look at more recent history, I'll leave what recent in terms of history means to you, but expulsions, pogroms, and the Holocaust, those are more recent traumas. But as Jewish individuals, we've all had communal traumas, particularly at least four examples of communal traumas that are embedded into the religious fabric of Jewish society, where we talk about these traumas on a year-to-year basis. And we have all altered our norms, our values, our customs based off of these traumas. You
Mhm.
take it one
Hmm.
step further.
So you're
Oh,
talking
and
about like say Tisha B'Av or the days that we do fasting, we're actually remembering experiences of collective trauma.
right.
Yeah.
We have
Got it.
we have four classic traumatic stories we tell as Jewish people that are baked into our fabric. One is Passover, the story of Passover. V'higadat lebencha, you tell your child what happened to you at Passover, which was the bondage we had in Egypt. We have the story of Hanukkah. We tell and we share the story where the difference within the Hanukkah story is they more wanted to end our Jewish culture and beliefs, not necessarily kill us as people first. That story gets passed down on a year-to-year basis, and we have cultural norms. We have the Purim story, where they tried to erase us from the face of the earth and kill all Jewish people, and we changed that and flipped it on its hat and turned into this perspective where we have, a day of laughter and a day of, turning things over, v'nahafok. And then the fourth one is Tisha B'Av, where it happened and it did happen and it did exist. And to this day, we still mourn and experience that loss. And on a year-to-year basis, we tell these four stories to our children. So our children are supposed to, like we say to them, it's as if you escaped Egypt this year. It's if the, temple wasn't built in your lifetime, you are also one of the perpetrators of that temple not being redeemed. So those are stories that we reshape, and those are collective communal traumas that have led us to what Ken was describing, which is what we would like to call intergenerational or multigenerational trauma, where you're passing the trauma down from one generation to the other generation. And in Judaism, in many ways, it's defined in terms of our spiritual beliefs, our customs, and the way we deal with things. But there's also biological pathways too. It is really fascinating, as you guys have mentioned in previous episodes as well, where there are studies that are showing that there's an altered stress regulation to hormones in Jewish people who've gone through collective traumas as compared to the general population. And there's epigenetic research that's suggesting that there is a biological embedment of trauma that we as Jewish people face that is passed down from person to person, regardless of if we are explicitly telling these stories anymore or not. I don't understand, and I'll be direct about it. I don't understand the differentiation between the genes as well myself. My wife's a genetic counselor. I always check with her. But there are specific genes that they can look at and say that we've seen on the, I think it's NR3CI gene or C1 gene, that there's a specific change that leads to a heightened level of stress reactivity, which is why Jewish people may respond to stress much faster, much quicker,
Right.
and looking around them more than other people might. And it's as if, the way I like to think of it, it's akin to our ancestors leaving literal fingerprints on us, regardless of us experiencing those types of situations ourselves.
Eli, it's interesting what you said. I remember I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, who was killed in the 1960s, leader of the Black Muslim movement. He made a comment I always remembered in that book. He said, no matter what audience he was in, even blindfolded, he could always tell when a Jew was asking him a question because they jump on you right away. The paranoia, the reactive nature of the personality. It's very fascinating what you're saying. I just wanted to add one comment as the history side of it, because you went into the holidays, which is very true. It's interesting that we actually, everyone knows the joke about a summary of all Jewish holidays. They tried to kill us. That's pretty traumatic. We
Mhm.
won, let's eat. And the fast days, they tried to kill us. They won, let's fast, which is the fast days we actually have. And the difference is, it also says a lot about Jews and food. I always jokingly say we have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Jews get post-traumatic stress disorder, which is the Yiddish word for pigging out. One of the, but it's really interesting. You've really lit up my brain there talking about how much I've never thought of the Jewish holiday cycle, especially rabbinic, how much of it is linked to trauma, but how it's dealt with on a level that's actually, maybe we'll go into this, that is actually very therapeutic in a lot of ways to be able to take what is some of the greatest threats, like Purim, everyone's getting dressed up and drunk. But Purim was like Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler's just, genocide, genocide redux, like we had it happen before. So it's a very, very interesting point. So thank you for bringing that up.
Of course. It's so
Awesome.
fascinating to me because the religion, and this is an entire other conversation as well, but all of Jewish customs and religion, when we look at modern day psychological research, are shaped in ways where if you follow the religious edicts, you are able to collectively overcome the trauma a lot easier. One of the classic examples of this is I did a lecture on Tisha B'Av this past year in regards to the psychology of Avelut, which is Jewish grieving, and how if you go through the Jewish grief process appropriately as defined by the codified laws of the Shulchan Aruch, which is our book of laws, you actually go through the 5 stages of grief within 1 year, and you're able to overcome from your grief a little bit quicker than what is normally seen as complex bereavement. And we see that when it comes to many of the things we as Jewish people have experienced, but it has also shaped our personality in many ways. And what we've noticed is that across Jewish people in general, before we get into the specifics of each, individual sect of Judaism as well, we've learned to internalize our trauma and deal with our trauma in some adaptive ways and oftentimes in certain maladaptive ways as well. One of the classic examples of this is that Jewish people have over-intellectualized things. We oftentimes organize and contain our emotional experiences more than the average population might. We tend to overprotect. We use humor, oftentimes dark and sarcastic humor, as a mechanism for relating to our pain, but also distancing ourselves from that pain as well. That has become a real, internalized fabric of Jewish society. You even see examples of dark humor within the biblical texts themselves in terms of people's responses to traumatic events. That is something that we've internalized as Jewish people over time. One of the other big ones is the idea, Ken mentioned it earlier, of hyperfunctioning and over-responsibility. That we've prioritized performance and caretaking roles within our community over individuation as a part of our identity. Few of the other ones, there's obviously so many we can mention, but some of the other ones that are shared across all Jewish people is the minimization or down regulation of your own distress. So we don't talk about our own distress as much to preserve our group stability. And lastly is going to be what's called somatization, which Ellie, you may be familiar with this as well. It's where people take their physiological distress and their psychological distress, and they start experiencing it through physical symptoms. The way I like to think of this is Jewish IBS.
Yeah.
That the idea that Jews have, or, over time, Jews have been lactose intolerant, may have been collective years of trauma on our guts. And now our guts just can't handle certain things anymore because we have physically started to experience our trauma in ways that was more acceptable. It's easier to say I have a stomach ache than I'm depressed. It's easier to say I have a headache than to say I'm very sad and I don't want to go to work today. That is something that we've internalized as a Jewish people as well.
That's interesting. Also, because you talk about Ashkenazim have a very high percentage of things like Crohn's and ulcerative colitis and things like that that are unique to the Jewish people. From yeah, exactly, feeling it literally in your guts. Very interesting. So that would be a real example of sort of an epigenetic, how it's absorbed into the DNA, especially maybe Ashkenazim, certain. Besides the genetic bottleneck we went through of too much inbreeding, which we talked about previously, just too much trauma, too much trauma. Interesting, very interesting indeed. So there must be a big difference between those disorders probably within the Sephardic world, and the Mizrahi world don't suffer from them as much because they don't have quite the same level of prolonged and intense trauma historically that we'll get into later.
Different,
Or they're
yeah.
or they're just metabolizing it differently, meaning
Right.
maybe they're okay with letting the emotions out, which takes a certain pressure off their guts, but there's other things. They might get more headaches or back stuff, or,
Right.
like
Exactly.
physically, it might just show up really differently. So I
True
think it's
that.
really fascinating. So do we feel good now turning to specifically talking about, we wanted to divide it into Ashkenaz, Sephardi, and Mizrahi because these groups historically have different experiences just in general of where they moved to, where they were kicked out of, how they lived, but also how they were traumatized, attacked, put through, challenged, all of these things. So what we thought was we would sort of section it out so we could address those very particular differences, which Elan, you write so incredibly about in one of the papers that I got to see of yours, where you really are studying the differences in these things. So maybe let's start with Ashkenazim. Rabbi Spiro, is there anything we need to know to catch us up historically as a context? And then, Elan, I would love to hear from you. Okay, so when we look, if we turn our lens very specifically to the Ashkenaz community, what are we seeing?
Yeah. So again, with the origins of Ashkenazi Jewry, I mean, there are Jews, again, Jews living in the Christian world, but before Europe was Christian, many centuries before, there were Jews living in Europe because the Roman Empire for centuries controlled the entire Mediterranean, from the coast of Spain to the coast of North Africa and everything in between. And we have instances of Jewish settlement at places out in Spain going back thousands of years ago, in Italy, But those are, relatively speaking, small communities. In the Second Temple period, which is the Second Jewish Commonwealth, you already have the best established Jewish community is going to be a Mizrahi community, which is going to be in what is basically Iraq. Babylon, the Iranian, Iraqi communities are the original diaspora communities who, although being born out of the massive trauma of the destruction of the First Temple and the dislocation from our land after 850 years of living in it, nonetheless, were able to adapt very successfully and rise to the top, although not without certain amazingly powerful traumatic events like the story of Purim, which takes place in that kind of intermediate period between the first and second temple. Ashkenazim, even though there are Jews living in Europe, the real birth of that demographic really takes off with the destruction of the second temple and the dumping of a huge amount of Jewish slaves into Rome, into the slave markets. Slaves were an incredibly valuable commodity. And Josephus, the great first century historian, says so many Jewish slaves were dumped onto the slave markets of Europe and Rome that Jewish slaves were cheaper than horses. So
Mm.
there you already have. It's interesting. And now Elon's really got me thinking now about trauma. I'm already thinking that the very origins of the massive Ashkenazi community is based on a very traumatic event. How did they come from being slaves to getting out of that? We have the idea of pidyon shvuim, being ransomed out or earning their own freedom. But that's an early experience going back almost 2,000 years ago. The real birth of the Ashkenazi community has to do with post-collapse of the Roman Empire, which is in the 5th century, Western Roman Empire, 475, when it ceases to exist. The Germanic invaders, the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, all those different people, later known as the Franks, take over. Jews migrate north of Italy is Germany. And that's where the word Ashkenaz comes from. And we have these communities on the Rhine, Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. It's the city of Speyer, Worms, with the Worms, and Mainz. That's the origin. And this is only a very small percentage of the Jewish world. The vast majority of Jews are living in the Middle East and starting to spread to North Africa and into Spain. So literally, you could arguably say the birth of Ashkenaz really comes from the time of the Holy Roman Empire as a really clearly identifiable community with Charlemagne and the founding of the Holy Roman Empire around the year 800, who invites Jews in. This is an interesting side point of the Jewish personality, is we being literate, numerate, dislocated people with no loyalties to our indigenous places we're sojourning in. I mean, Jews are not indigenous to Germany, have no tribal loyalty to that area. Having connections around the world with other Jews, being multilingual, and being really at the mercy of whoever will tolerate us, are a great commodity to be used throughout the history of Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and Mizrahi Jews, the non-Jewish world, and the nobility and the landed wealthy people are always making good use of us. So they will be invited into these communities. So by the time you get to 1200 or so years ago, you already have these well-established Jewish communities in what is Germany along the Rhine. And we don't see it's, people think of European history, medieval Europe, as being a horrible period of time. We have to recognize that unlike places like Babylon, or Iraq, Persia, where the significant Jewish communities, Jews are a teeny tiny minority in what is a very non, like really a place that has little interaction historically with Jews, is a very different culture, a culture that is deeply superstitious, great, illiterate, very poor. This is the time of feudal Europe as the feudal system arises. So we, being a tiny minority in a lot of, surrounded by a lot of poor, superstitious people, is not a great situation. But we don't really, people talk about the Dark Ages. We don't have massive amounts of anti-Jewish violence in the early medieval period. I mean, there's plenty going on always. Jews are always living, as we say in Yiddish, on spilkas, because we don't have, remember, this whole period of time, whether Jews are living in the Ashkenazi world or the Sephardi world, that we don't generally have rights. I mean, most people don't have citizenship in the world back then, but we are always on the edge and living in a very precarious situation. But when we fast forward to 1,000 years ago, in 1095, when Pope Urban II in Clermont in France calls for a crusade to, first of all, free up the Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire, from being attacked by the Seljuk Turks, and also to, more importantly, to take the Holy Land back and the Holy Sepulchre Church in the Old City. That lets loose a mob that takes off And basically, pogroms, that's actually a term that comes in later in history, but anti-Jewish violence, led on by certain rabble rousers, uh, will lead to open attacks, open violence against Jews in primarily in the Rhine, led by people named like Peter the Hermit, Count Emicio. You read the history of the Crusades, you learn all about these people. The basic idea was, we're going to, save the Holy Sepulchre where Jesus is buried, but the people who like caused his death are right here on the way to the Holy Land. And so this will lead to open violence against the Jews of Speyer, Worms, Mainz, where a huge percentage of them will be murdered. Many of them will choose martyrdom, which is also very interesting. We got to get into this later, Elan. The difference between the Sephardi reaction to what happens in Spain and in 14th to 15th centuries with mass conversion versus the Ashkenazi default position is almost always die, is really, really interesting. There's definitely something there. It's much more extreme. The Kel Male Rachamim prayer that we say for a yortzeit, for an azkara, when someone dies, or is recited on Memorial Day in Israel, is originates during the time of the Crusades. And Judaism has created the real martyrdom literature. It exists somewhat in the Talmud, but it really starts to begin at this period of time. But we have basically going on, it's all downhill from there, because you have the 11th century of the Crusades, you have basically the 14th century, which is a really rough time for Europe. You have the Black Death. Jews are blamed for that. You fast forward then, and Jews are thrown out of all of Western European countries. They end up migrating eventually, starting already 13th century, but really 15th, 16th centuries, having been thrown out of everywhere else and killed out and expelled. They move into Eastern Europe, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where they're invited in by the nobility again to run their feudal estates. And things are going well there. There's a golden age in all of these places, but that comes really crashing down with the Khmelnytsky massacres in the 17th century, where the center of the Jewish world is already this part of the world. It's moved from being Sephardic and Mizrahi to Ashkenazi. Most of the Jews in the world are living there, and 50 to 100,000 Jews were killed in 1648 and 1649. And then, of course, there's all kinds of stuff in between, the Russian Revolution, Sivan Petliura in Ukraine. But of course, the culminating traumatic event of all traumatic events is going to be, of course, the Holocaust, where European Jewry, which was almost 90% of the Jews in the world, of the 17 million Jews pre-Holocaust, one out of every three Jews is killed, and overwhelmingly 99% of those will be Jews living in Eastern Europe. So it really, we have 1,000 years of intense trauma, of massive periods of not just expulsion and persecution, but of actual physically killing out Jews, who, of course, during that entire time, often living with restrictions, but the trauma is very extreme, punctuated by periods of really attempted genocide.
What you just described leads me into something I missed a little earlier, which is the difference between intergenerational and multi-generational trauma. What you're describing is what we like to call multi-generational trauma, which is the traumatic events that across multiple generations have embedded into the fabric of society. All of the, description you just gave is the multi-generational background of trauma with Ashkenazi Jews. When we look at the term, which we hear frequently as well, intergenerational trauma, that's more generation to generation. For example, the generation we're currently in right now is going to pass down intergenerational trauma related to October 7th to the generation that is growing up now. And that will then turn into multi-generational trauma 4 or 5 generations down the road from now, related to the experiences of October 7th. So there's that piece of one generation to the next, the link that you gave of passing it down from group to group, which really leads me to actually a key point before we get into the distinction that I think we should be sharing, which is that what we're going to talk about right now are cultural variations. And for the purposes of what we're describing here, we've kind of grouped them into these 3 groups. But not every single one of the groups experienced every single one of those things themselves. And therefore, you're going to have differentiation groups as well. So we're going to give a little bit more of like a heuristic or just a generalization for the purposes of our discussion here. But there are different people who grew up in different Ashkenazi communities who define themselves as Ashkenaz, but have very different experiences related to trauma based off of where their families inherited that experience as well.
Mhm.
That we'll see in terms of the cultural variations, even within each individual subgroup as well. We're just going to look a little bit more at, an overview rather than like uniform classifications or rigid classifications as well.
I think this is also so interesting for me because even in the Torah itself, we see the intergenerational trauma from those who were enslaved to the next generation. They had to die out, and then it was the next generation that would actually go into the land. And so, in a way, we're seeing even the Torah speak to how though the ones who experienced it directly, but then their children were going to take instructions differently. They were going to be able to handle going into the land differently. There was already stuff going on there. So I think that's partly what you're referring to, and we see it even all the way in the beginnings of our story.
Yeah, exactly. The difference between those who entered the land versus those who didn't enter the land, what they saw and what they experienced, is so different. To the purposes of a little bit of our discussion here as well, I want to look a little bit at the dominant patterns within the Ashkenazi community. And again, like we mentioned earlier, not to minimize or say that one group doesn't have this or other groups have these. It's
Right.
not a trauma, game of Jeopardy where one group has better trauma or worse trauma than others. It's just a different way of how we experience the trauma. But one of the common themes you'll see within the Ashkenazi subgroups is going to be more of what we define as an internalization of the threat. So they internalize the threats that they went through, and what that leads to is two basic things. One
Hmm.
is there's a high level of emotional restraint. So this doesn't mean that Ashkenazim don't have emotions, even though
Hmm.
contrary to popular belief, or don't show emotions, but the way they manage their emotions are going to be different. They're going to be more, instead of being expressed outwardly, they're going to be expressed inwardly. And the
Hmm.
same goes with distress. Distress is going to be more contained, organized, and worked through in an intellectually internal way rather than external way.
Hmm.
Mm.
Okay.
Um,
I can't wait to hear like how this looks exactly. Give us examples. So this
Yeah.
is fascinating.
So in practice, one of the ways you see this is in the kind of anticipation, the planning and the evaluation that may be happening in this population as compared to some other populations. I'll give a small example and then we'll kind of pull it back and talk about it a little bit more. When my kids were born, when my young kids were born, my wife is also Persian. Both of us are Persian. My sister-in-law, my brother's wife, is Ashkenazi. She comes from a European background and from a South African background. When my kids were born, we didn't get them passports right away. We didn't have passports right away. And when my sister-in-law heard this and found this out, she was mortified. She was shocked. How do you not have a passport ready to go at any time for your children to leave? That wasn't something that we internalized as
Right.
Iranians when we came to America. My parents taught us that we're safe here, we're happy here, we're
Hmm.
comfortable here. My sister-in-law learned that you always have a go bag, you always have a passport ready, you always have that experience from her father
Hmm.
coming from a Holocaust background and her mother coming from a South African background, the traumas they experienced in South Africa.
Hmm.
That rationalization of internalizing the threat and thinking through methodically, not just that you have your passport, where's your passport, what do you have with it, and where will you go, was something that
Right.
you see with Ashkenazim more than you were seeing with Sephardim.
Hmm.
And that is oftentimes also seen through this lens of control and predictability. Ashkenazim have created a little bit more of a mechanism of pattern that is wanting to control and be predictable when it comes to their safety. So having routine, having structure, having that creates more predictability in your life. And the same with achievement. We see that achievement creates predictability because it gives you a little bit more leverage and it gives you a little bit longer of a rope when it comes to the trauma that may be experienced. In backgrounds in Europe, the people who were the doctors, the people who served in the military previously in World War I had a little bit more latitude when it came to World War II, their experiences, because they had achievement and they had given back to society in certain ways. It gained them the buy-in and the trust that they were going to be able to use that as their possible escape route in the future.
Interesting. So meaning a title gave them safety. So that's the whole joke, if you're a doctor or a lawyer or a rabbi, like your Jewish mom is like super happy. But now I understand that it meant safety. It meant you had
Mhm.
money, you had agency, you had influence, and all the things that you might need in order to get out quickly.
Interesting,
Interesting.
very
That's
interesting.
fascinating.
Even though it didn't, with Hitler, ultimately it didn't work. But it's interesting, when Hitler comes to power, the Jewish community of Germany goes and publishes a huge book showing all the great things they had done and how essential they were for the society. The hardcore guys don't care about that, but that's a really interesting insight into that incredible Jewish drive and especially amongst Ashkenazim, of being a professional.
And what's interesting with that as well is you see that oftentimes as a persistent internal anxiety. May not be visible from the outside, but it's kind of like a duck paddling on water where like they look calm on the surface, but underneath there's constantly the movement going on, that when you tie a constant internal anxiety to a manifestation of that externally as a person, the way you deal with that is to become achievement oriented. You have to have worth. You have to be tied to productivity. You have to be responsible. And creating that kind of responsibility for yourself takes your anxiety and does something with it. It serves a purpose for it. And I think that's part of what Ken, you were describing earlier on in regards to, constantly wanting to fix the world. If I can take my anxiety on the inside and create meaning and achievement for everyone outside of me, maybe they'll just eventually leave me alone and stop trying to kill me. That deep
Interesting.
down, there's a little bit of that experience as well, that over preparedness is normalized.
That's
So
very
wild because as a convert, when I came into the Jewish community, I remember noticing something very particular, which was in every room I was in, it was always the most exhausted or the busiest person that was considered the big person in the room. The most important person here is the one that's the most busy or the one that's most tired. Like whoever's doing the most is obviously the most important person here, which was unique. I hadn't seen that before. So that's fascinating.
What's interesting about that is there's strengths and there's some costs that are associated with that. The strengths are going to be that people learn a strong moral and ethical responsibility for others. They learn how to deal with stress for long, long extended periods of time. But the cost to that is that those of us who aren't able to achieve at the same high level as the person you're describing, they aren't able to be the exhausted individual who's burning the candle at both ends constantly at all times, see ourselves as either guilty or feel more vulnerable that we are unable
Yeah.
to achieve. What's
Yeah.
fascinating, and this is collective across all of my friends who are Jewish, not just the Sephardi ones. I finished graduate school at 22. That's when I finished my graduate school. I
Wow.
had my master's and I was licensed by 24. And the response I got in the non-Jewish community was like, you're a child and you've gone through graduate school. You're a wonderkin. And in the Jewish community, the response I got was, why aren't you married yet? I don't understand. How are you 24 and you're not
Right.
married?
exactly,
And the pressure and
exactly.
the stress placed at young ages is a good thing because we as Jews have internalized a manifestation of, passing our delayed gratification. That experience is something that's internalized as Jewish people. But
Yeah.
that's not for everybody, and it's not easy to be able to constantly feel like I have to achieve to have value and worth.
Mm,
That's
mm.
very interesting. That's super. It's funny how Jewish humor represents, especially Ashkenazim. You mentioned humor, and we talk about how humor is a great coping mechanism. And I find, like Russian Jews, I mean, I studied in the Soviet Union. I speak Russian. I found they had the best sense of humor. It was always very self-deprecating about their situation. But we were talking about the kind of the way the neuroses is not just internally epigenetically passed on, but how the pressure, that joke about the discussion of when is a fetus viable, when can it survive outside the womb, and the Jewish mother's answer is when it graduates from medical or law school. so, so that's very, very interesting. I'm
I,
learning a lot here. I find this
I
fascinating.
Yeah.
I mentioned this to Ken in passing at the Passover program while we were standing outside grabbing our, multiple plates of food, which is also another Jewish experience. But I
Yeah.
mentioned to him that one of the stories of Passover, which it comes from an Ashkenazi background as well, one of the stories of Passover is the idea of the seventh day of Passover is a holiday because we parted the Red Sea and we went through that experience of going through the Red Sea. Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, who is of German background. And Ken can date me on this, but I believe in the 1600s or 1700s
No,
of
no,
Germany.
late
Eight,
night.
18,
He was late 18th, early 19th centuries. Well,
18th,
he was late.
19th.
Mm,
Yeah, he was.
He was a little
Excuse
later,
me.
but
He's late 19th century. Excuse me, Hirsch. Yeah.
German with that very,
yeah.
rigid perspective on things, he looks at the story of the experience of the parting of the Red Sea, where before the Jews are stuck at that crossroads, they turn to God and they say, how did you bring us out here? Why are we here? Aren't there enough burial plots in Egypt? You brought us to the desert to kill us.
Mhm.
And God doesn't respond in the same way that he responds every other time the Jews complained. And Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch says that that's because this wasn't a complaint. You should read this as sarcasm. The Jews looked to God and said,
Wow.
you literally have pushed us here, and weren't there not enough burial plots in Egypt for kill us in Egypt? Well, okay, well, and he sees it as an intellectualization of their trauma through sarcasm. And we know in modern research these days that one of the highest forms of resiliency related to traumatic events is to be able to have dark humor related to the thing that happened to you. That is
Mm.
a healthy way of coping with a mechanism of trauma. And he's describing this as a German Jew with what was going on in Germany at the time that was mentioned. It's just, to me, it's humorous that a German Jew is the one who sees this as the
Humor.
hilarious story.
That's very
Yeah,
German. It's
that's
kind of like the
amazing.
line in Fiddler on the Roof when Tevye says, "You God, you the chosen people. Couldn't you have chosen someone else?" Very cynical, but very much Jewish humor.
Yeah. And
Amazing.
one of the other, I think, fascinating ways we've seen some of this manifest in Ashkenazim, as we were mentioning at the get-go, part of the research that I was working on to kind of start coalescing some of these ideas was just a lot of interviews with individuals who've gone through their own historical background and trauma. The story we asked them was, tell us your Jewish story that was passed down inherently to you in terms of trauma. And we got the opportunity to review quite a lot of footage within the, archives of Yad Vashem as well, in terms of interviews of Holocaust survivors. One of the fascinating stories that kept coming over again was, and I heard this from multiple people, was that growing up, their mother used to always remind them that anytime they had to leave the house or go somewhere, they would take quarters with them, a bag of quarters. And for those of us who this predates cell phones, as we mentioned earlier as well, the idea of taking quarters was so that they'd always have money to be able to put into a phone booth so that they can call home. So they experience this thought of, oh, my parents just want me to call them because my parents love me and they want to know where I am at all times. That
Right.
was an internalization of anxiety. The
Mm,
parents' way of dealing with anxiety was, I love you, I want to know where you are, because it wasn't safe to say out loud, I'm anxious for you, where you are at all times. Instead,
yeah.
the love manifested through their anxiety.
Right.
Interesting.
Right. So here it's like love is tracking. If you're not being tracked, then, you don't feel loved and they don't feel like they're loving you. Is that what
Mhm.
you mean?
Yeah. And it kind of turned into a managed control and restraint that you see in the Ashkenazi population as a whole. And I
Mm,
think it was one of the
mm.
jokes I made with Ken on our Pesach program as well. I asked, why is it that Ashkenazi davening, prayer, just sounds so sad and so reserved at all times? Like they're singing happy things, but the tune makes me feel like I'm at a funeral.
Mm,
And that I think plays a factor into one, there's cantorial, passing down to Catholic Church and some of those experiences that we've had. But the manifestation of the religion, the manifestation of your prayer is going to be in a very controlled, contrite way with specific times. You have start times and you have end times. And you look, as we would get into later on, Sephardim or Edut Mizrahi, when we do our slichot, which is our, confessions, it's a vibe. There's people partying and
yes.
dancing to their confessions as compared to the contrite looks you may see. That is one of the ways that we've seen this integration of some of these historical trauma experiences into just our day-to-day experiences as Jews as well.
It's
That's
very
actually a
interesting.
great, sorry, I just want to say, Ken, there's a great episode by Eli Lake on his podcast where he talks about why is it that Jews wrote all the best Christmas songs? And he said because from the cantorial tradition, they brought minor chords into like songs that were supposed to be about a happy holiday. So they were able to add this wistfulness and this sadness and this longing that didn't exist in the tunes at the time. And it made something altogether new and different and beautiful and long lasting. And so I think it's an interesting example of what you say, where something maladaptive, but it can also bring a lot of art and beauty and difference.
Very, very interesting. Really interesting. My brain is just, you're triggering all these little thoughts in my head, which you really see with not just the music. Of course, the Sephardi music is colored by the musical experience of living in the Arab Islamic world. I always remember years ago in yeshiva, we were singing one night. We got together with a bunch of guys from Port Yosef, the Sephardic yeshiva in the old city, and we decided to trade off like a song competition and and they all sounded like they were in the mosque, and we all sounded like we were in a church. But there's definitely something about the emotional experience. Everything you're talking about explains so much. Speaking of humor, like Modi is the guy for this. He does
Hmm.
that little skit about how an Ashkenazi or a Sephardi guy says Shabbat Shalom to you. The Ashkenazi guy with the fish-like handshake, Shabbos. It's like almost depressing. And the Sephardi guys, Shabbat Shalom. The squeezing of so much of the life out of Ashkenazi Jewry is, you just see it until today, which was why, Hasidut, the over intellectualizing thinking, you could do a whole subclass on the development of and reaction of movements in Judaism, the reaction against Hasidut. It was too much emotional, changing customs, but the whole idea of bringing prayer and joy and singing and physical movement in, it just, it hit such a pushback from a world that was so into control and restraint. And you see that spills all the way up until today. It's just such an interesting topic to see how Judaism developed. There's one thing, we're not going to deal with it now, but we should talk about it at some point later on, is that Ashkenazi went through one more phase. Besides the physical threats, being blamed for the Black Death and poisoning wells and pogroms and killing the Tsar and you name it, Ashkenazi went through spiritual threats after having survived all of being beaten up. Then they had to deal with all the experiences of Jews trying to engage with modernity and dealing with enlightened Jews who were trying, like the Hellenist Jews of the Hanukkah story, to bring them out of their ancient worldview into modernity by dropping their Judaism, or by secular Zionist leaders trying to create a Jewish state without like really Judaism in it as a nationalist state, or by offshoot movements like the Reform movement. And so it's kind of like getting yourself beaten down to a pulp and then being sat in a chair with a light on you and then like interrogated with psychological like music blasting and lights flashing. So you get a level of kind of trauma that I think is unique. This, and we'll see with later, the Sephardic world didn't go through that. They didn't go through the Enlightenment and the Reform movement and seculars that they got traumatized by in their own way later, especially the secular Zionists with all the Sephardi immigrants from the Middle East. But everything plays in. I just see the more we talk about this, how much it colors and how much when you stand back and look at it, it's kind of like almost a light bulb going off in your head. Like now I understand. And how much of it is multi-generational, even though I'm sitting here in Muncie, New York, with a bunch of Jews living in a level of freedom and materialism and comfort that very few Jews in history have ever lived through, yet they exhibit in their own way all of the past trauma that collectively are their ancestors shared over like the last 1,000 years. Very interesting.
So
When you
Elan,
look
tell us
through
more. I totally want to hear more. I'm curious.
when you're looking through what you're describing, I hadn't looked into this, but it's a clear, description. Each time you see, I think, a spiritual bifurcation within the Ashkenazi community in terms of,
Mm.
Orthodox to conservative to reform or reconstructionist, however you want to see that, I'm certain we can find some kind of inability to process a traumatic event where there's a total beyond comprehension of that trauma. And the
Mhm.
response to that is an adjustment to the religion or
Mhm.
adjustment to the experience.
Mhm.
And what's interesting, as you described as well, Ken, is that this kind of leads to something which is not commonly talked about, but you see more within the Ashkenazi background, this idea of people going off the derech. In Judaism, the idea of off the derech meaning going off the path, derech meaning path. people go off the path, that they just, shook all the responsibility and the pressure of being Jewish to the point where they don't want to identify as Jewish. The classic example of this is there was a non-kosher restaurant that was called Treif. And the reason, Treif meaning non-kosher, it was made by a Jew, it was run by a Jew, and he put pork in every single item that he served purposefully to, trafe up and experience the opposite of what his historical experience has been like. That is a coping mechanism. That is a coping mechanism for the trauma of experiencing that pressure. You grow up in a stoic house. You grow up in a home where you're not experiencing as much of that love and affection just for no reason. The love and affection is tied to an anxiousness. You perform, you experience praise. You don't perform, you don't experience praise. And oftentimes that praise is through the lens of religion or religious experiences. So you take some of that angst and you don't know what to do with it. And one of the ways to address it is to shuck all the responsibility of spirituality and say, this religion isn't for me anymore. Within the Sephardi community, we don't necessarily have the idea of people being off the derech, or in the Edut Mizrachi community. We had more traditional. People were traditional. They did what they knew because their father did that. When they learned more, they may have done more or they didn't do more. But that experience is completely a trauma response, whether we see it now, this day in age, where we have individuals who are coming back, choser b'tshuva, returning back to their faith, and becoming closer. The idea of kiruv is bringing people closer. Oftentimes, they can point to some kind of traumatic story in their life and say, this is the reason why I decided to go off. They weren't able to internalize and inculcate that trauma through the lens of what they learned historically. So they decided to just remove themselves from that.
Hmm.
And modern times now, with what's going on since October 7th, you're seeing a lot more Jews have to reconcile and deal with that, where they have not viewed themselves as Jewish. They have not seen themselves as Jewish. But the society is now saying to them, you are Jewish, and we will treat you like we treat every other Jew. So they're deciding now, well, if the out group doesn't want me anymore, I might have to find my way back to my individual in group.
Mm.
The idea of, October 8th Jews, which we're hearing about and seeing, which is more of an Ashkenazi phenomenon as well than a Sephardi or Mizrahi phenomenon.
Maybe we should
Yeah.
coin a new term. It just popped into my brain because I'm a frustrated advertising guy. The term kiruv means to bring someone close, from karev. Maybe we should coin the phrase firuv,
Mm. Right.
like Jews
Yeah.
being scared back to their Judaism. Wow,
That's
that's a wild
that's
idea. Okay, but I just want to
and that
comment on something you said like, quickly. I heard a great line from a guy who wrote a book who was raised religious in Israel and went off and came back. He's a real Baal Tshuva. It's a book called Is There a Chance for Love? And I read this book over 40 years ago, but he said he had a great line that explained a lot about Ashkenazi Jewry. He said they squeezed the Torah so tight to hold on to it that they squeezed the life out of it.
mm,
And that was like a
mm,
very powerful line. And just to
I love
comment on
that.
something else you said about, because the Sephardi world didn't go to the physical and anti-religious trauma that Ashkenazi world went through, what was killed off in the Holocaust, besides one out of every three Jews, were all those kind of simple, just traditional-ish Jews. to and the Jewish world, this is a whole nother topic that we have to talk about, Ellie, in a different episode. The Jewish world has rebuilt itself around yeshivot and a much more hardcore, solid religious framework than it ever had. The vast majority of Jews were not learning in yeshivot. It was a very elite thing. So now you get a core that is so much a combination of the trauma and the almost the hyper focus on learning and trying to fight off all the spiritual threats now. So you get a kind of a hybrid, supercharged version of a Jewish Ashkenazi personality, and that is very unusual, but is very much explained by all the cultural experiences and the trauma that you're talking about.
Yeah, we
Manifested
actually
literally,
sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Elan.
manifested literally through the lens of being black and white. The uniform of
Totally.
of of of, of how they look is black and white.
Yeah,
Mhm.
100%. We actually did 3 episodes right before October 7th on the history of Orthodox Judaism. And we talk a little bit about that experience. How is that affecting cohesiveness in the community, a feeling of achdus, a feeling of openness, all of those things. So I would recommend, if that's something people are interested in, they can go back and check that out. But I have a question for you, Elan, around it seems to me that one of the longings in the Ashkenazi community was to be a part of the European elite, right? To be a part of this world that they were absolutely shut out of. And um, sometimes what I see in the Ashkenazi community, I think, is a certain safety and sameness. So people who assimilate, they want to be just like the people they assimilate to. Like I'm more American than the Americans. And then even in the religious world, it's like if you have to be exactly the same as everybody else in the group. Do you think that's an outgrowth of that European experience? And is that different than Sephardi and Mizrahi?
It's a good question. I'd have to think it through a little bit more to know if there's a distinction, but I do think that there's safety in uniformity.
Mm,
And I think there's a part in that, that if I don't stand out and you can't pick me out of the crowd, then I am safer. So
Mhm.
if everyone
interesting.
wears a certain, if everyone's wearing a certain hat or a certain color, if everyone has certain haircuts, then I'll do those things as well. If everyone plays baseball, then we'll play baseball. That experience, and we as children do that at young ages. You see all your friends around you have an interest. We gain our common interest from the people who are around us. On a societal level, I don't see any difference in that as well. That on a societal level, if there are common interests in that society in that space, then you're going to do that as well. And I do think that there's something safe in just being able to have that. But at the same time, if you are seeing that the other people are gaining some kind of recognition, or you're seeing those other individuals as seen as great achievers, or you see them as high society individuals, that strong drive towards achievement is part of self-worth, and that also is safe as well. Because if I'm closer to the decision making, maybe I can shape the decision making. And if I can't shape the decision making, maybe I'll know the signs to need to escape a little earlier than other people might have as well. And interestingly enough, we've had so many historical examples of that where Jews found themselves in high society, but in turn, instead of using that as a marker for we need to escape sooner, they used it as a cry out for no, we're safe, we're good, and they doubled down the buy-in in hopes that that may have made them safer in society, and that didn't turn out the way it needed to turn out either.
Mhm.
Wow, that's fascinating. That's really
Yeah.
wild.
to
Okay,
to something to something you had said earlier, Ken.
please, yeah.
I don't want to forget this because I think it's fascinating. The even in this episode, the use of Ken's humor in these moments which is so fascinating that that sense of humor that you have plays into this history. Not to say that you're not funny, you are funny, but culturally you've gained that sense of humor as well. And it reminds me that there was this interview with Robin Williams in Germany, and they asked him, why don't we have such good comedy scenes in Germany as compared to America? And he said, have you considered that maybe you killed all the funny people?
I remember that line.
Yeah,
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that pause in him being genuine and the person not understanding what he even meant by that in
right,
that moment
right.
is this internalization of we as people have learned
Mm,
to cope with our trauma in different ways than many other people outside of society have. That
mhm.
Holocaust joke is terrifying to other people, but to us, somehow it's hilarious. And the
Yeah.
hilarity is our way of being able to deal with the trauma that we experienced.
Someone literally yesterday just told me a story of there were two girls sitting together and another boy was sitting with them. The boy made and one of them was Jewish and the other one wasn't. And the boy made a Holocaust joke. And the Jewish girl laughed, and the other girl that wasn't Jewish was highly offended. You can't make jokes like that. That's totally inappropriate. And the Jewish girl's like laughing at her. She's like, you don't know what you're talking about. But it from the outside, it's so shocking to people. But from the inside, it's like it releases the pressure.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I get this all the time. I tell jokes about Jewish jokes, and I know a lot of jokes. And then I say, I always say at the end, when I say to my non-Jewish friends, I say, these are jokes that you can't tell. I can say them because I've been through it. If you say it, it's anti-Semitic. If I say it, it's a way of, it's literally, it's a form of therapy. It's just a point of poking fun at. And it's so important, by the way, so much of the world has had like a sense of humorectomy, as I call it, when you can't laugh at things, you see this on a lot of the, I don't want to get into politics, but a part of the political spectrum finds everything offensive.
Mhm.
That is very anti-therapeutic. You could speak to that, I'm sure, but when you can't, I mean, humor is so good because it illustrates things, but it's such a way of releasing pressure on something. It might not really be funny, but there is an aspect of it. It's necessary to do because if not, you just explode, basically. If we didn't learn as Jews how to have the best sense of humor, and really Jews do have the best sense of humor, I think. I think per capita number of stand-up comics we have, is incredible. But it comes out of a combination of going through a very unique experience and being, quick on our feet. You got to be smart to be a good comedian.
Hu-
So yeah.
humor allows us to maintain a proximity to our pain without having a full exposure to the pain.
Mm,
So you're
Mm,
not
very
masking
true.
it, you're not closing it, you're not bottling it up. It's like we're
mm,
close to the pain, so we know the pain is there, but I'm not going to let the pain overwhelm me, and therefore I
mm,
make light of it. You have to be
mm,
close to trauma to joke about trauma. You can't do it
mm,
from a distance.
mm.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
that's beautiful. It means we're not allowing ourselves to be in denial. Like it's um, saying it's true and yet not falling apart at the same time. Wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's beautiful. So maybe in closing, we're going to do one more, maybe two more episodes, see how this goes. But next episode, we're going to dig into a little bit more about Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. Elan, is there anything else that we need to know on this topic related to Ashkenazi Jews and what we're seeing and how it plays out in the population today? Anything that would be we can carry with us, and maybe people listening can start to sort of examine themselves and say, "Hey, is this me?"
Yeah, I think what's fascinating is for us to remember when it comes to this and other populations as well, is that trauma is something that's transmitted, but resiliency is also transmitted. That the idea of containment and meaning and rebuilding as Jews and community is also something that was passed down to us from generation to generation. And as
Mm,
individuals, I look at this as myself as a father and a parent too.
mm,
There were so many things that were passed down to me by the previous generation that they needed to survive.
mm.
They were useful for them and they were survival mechanisms. I now get the opportunity to reflect on my own and say, do I still need these things to get passed down to the next generation below me?
What a great
Um,
question.
I'm not forgetting my past. I'm not shucking the responsibilities my parents provided me, but what worked for my parents worked because they escaped what they escaped.
Mm,
I now have to make meaning of new circumstances and situations. And while what we're describing here, in terms of how Ashkenazim deal with stress and sadness and grief and pain, for example, is all historically passed down from generation to generation, it
mhm.
doesn't then mean that that's how we have to find ourselves responding to our experiences today. We get to make meaning of our own events ourselves and decide what were some of the strengths that were passed down to us and what may have been some of the costs of those experiences they went through to make our own individual decisions. We are not stuck in our history. We get to make our own choices. We do still have that, Bechira and that free will of our experience going forward, even though many generations have shaped how we may choose to respond to that circumstance.
Mm,
Mm.
beautiful. Yeah, and I feel so passionately that just starting to talk about it is like the first opportunity to start to reflect on, are these tools still useful? So that's really beautiful. Thank you. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
Just to close, I mean, I love this topic. I've been thinking about it for years, but I never had an expert like you to like talk about it with any kind of authority. But it's so important in terms of our whole focus of this podcast is remember what's next. And it's not
Hmm.
just historical events, it's the internalness of, and I'm really interested in having the conversation. We say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That is such a great quote about the Jewish people individually and collectively to be so fast on our feet. And it goes all the way back to, Jacob dealing with Lavan. Like
Yeah.
you, you got to outsmart these people and try and escape in a way that doesn't cripple you and not living. What's also interesting is not how we don't wallow in it. We deal with it, but it hasn't kept us. So many other peoples have like kind of like wallowing in it and feeling sorry for themselves and how we've taken it and been proactive, but also really what what it means for the challenges of reconstituting a Jewish state with putting all these people who've gone through different experiences and trauma back in the same country again is kind of like a holistic healing experience. But how we can use all of that, because it has made us stronger. The fact that the Israeli economy is exploding after October 7th is a great kind of national economic vision of the Jewish people in general. And the fact that Israelis who go through more trauma in the modern world today than anyone else probably are listed as one of the top 5 happiest people on the planet really says a lot about how we've managed to take this inside of us and move forward with it and use it in a way that's productive, albeit with a lot of scar tissue on the side too. So I'm really excited to continue this conversation. Elan, thank you so much. This was super interesting.
My
Hmm.
pleasure. Thank you for
Yeah.
having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. Okay, so in the liner notes, you will be able to find more information about our guest today, Professor Javanfard, about Rabbi Ken Spiro, myself. We are going to continue this series, as I said, maybe one, maybe two. We're just figuring out what that looks like in terms of being able to get to all of this information. If you like this type of conversation, please like, share, and subscribe. You can also reach any one of us. I'll put everyone's contact information in the liner notes. And if you'd like to support the podcast, we have a new setup on something called Ko-fi. The link is in the notes, which is a way that if you'd like to send us a little tip, a thank you, or support us monthly to continue to do this labor of love, we would love to hear from you, and we always appreciate the support. Leave us a comment and let us know what you thought. Send us a question. Thank you so much, Professor Elan Javanfard and Rabbi Ken Spiro. For myself, Ellie Bass, thank you for joining us.